This is East Asia Tonight.
Good Friday evening, I'm Mateli Edwards. Tonight's top stories from East Asia. President Trump's new tariffs draw swift reactions across the region, with China condemning the move and Japan expressing regret. The White House says the measures target unfair trade practices. Now, 4 days of ASEAN talks wrap up in Manila, with maritime concerns dominating discussions on regional security. 4 more countries have also joined the ASEAN Peace Pact, known as the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. Well, the gathering also highlighted ASEAN's global reach. The EU's foreign policy chief says Europe's security is closely linked to that of Southeast Asia. And Asian shares sink, battered by a spike in oil prices and worries about the AI investment boom. Also tonight, a settlement in South Korea's divorce of the century. SK Group's chairman is ordered to pay his ex-wife $640 million, a ruling that could reshape how family business fortunes are divided. Plus, flying taxis may be grabbing headlines at Shanghai's low-altitude economy expo, but it's the drones tackling everything from firefighting to deliveries that could take off first. A new U.S. tariff offensive is targeting some of Asia's biggest economies. China, Japan, South Korea are among 60 trading partners facing fresh duties on their U.S. exports. Now, Washington claims that the move is aimed at countries it says are not doing enough to keep forced labor out of their supply chains. The new levies, ranging from 10 to 12.5%, replace a temporary global tariff that expired today. The targeted economies account for the bulk of U.S. trade. China, Japan, South Korea, and Singapore are among those facing the higher 12.5% duty. But some economies, including Japan and South Korea, receive limited relief under existing trade agreements with Washington. While countries judged to have stronger measures against forced labor face the lower 10% rate. Not every product is affected, though. Steel, aluminum, automobiles, and auto parts are excluded because they're already covered by separate U.S. national security tariffs. Food, agricultural products, fertilizers, and energy products are also exempt. Now, the new tariffs are already drawing criticism across the region. China has opposed the move, adding that trade wars do not serve any parties. Meanwhile, Japan says it regrets the latest U.S. tariffs, insisting its trade practices comply with international rules.
日米間では昨年の合意は不変であり、双方がその実施に引き続きコミットしているとの理解を共有しております。米国に対し、最終的に日本に対して昨年の合意を超える追加関税を課さないことも確認をしているところです。引き続き米側との意思疎通を継続してまいります。
South Korean officials are also consulting the U.S. to preserve their existing trade pact. Seoul warns that if these new tariffs are combined with possible future duties linked to excess industrial production, its overall tariff rate could climb above 15%. Now, for more on this, we have CNA's Tan Yu-Guan joining us live from Shanghai. So, Yu-Guan, China among those economies facing the higher tariff rate. What has Beijing's response been?
Well, so far, and the key word here is so far, the reaction has been pretty muted. We did get a reaction from the regular foreign ministry briefing today. Here's what the spokesperson said.
中方在中美经贸问题上的立场是一贯的、明确的，反对各种形式的单边关税措施。关税战、贸易战不符合任何一方利益。
No surprises there. We really can't expect China to welcome the tariffs. After all, China is among the economies facing the higher 12.5% tariff rate. But we must remember this isn't a case of going from 0 to 12.5%. For Chinese goods going into the US, they will be going from facing a 10% temporary tariff that's applied across the board for all imports to the US to a higher 12.5%. So compared with the previous levy, the immediate increase is 2.5 percentage point. But this new tariff layer comes on top of existing US tariffs on many Chinese goods, including those imposed earlier by the Section 301 tariffs imposed during the first Trump administration. Now, so far, Beijing has stopped short of announcing new retaliatory tariffs against Washington, but that could be a function of some of these measures being considered and weighed by senior officials on various levels of the Chinese government. Watchers say China certainly has options to retaliate like it did before. These includes export controls, and that's something that Beijing has used in previous disputes.
So you're going to try to understand this because Washington and Beijing, well, they've been trying to stabilize ties ahead of President Xi's expected visit to the U.S. in September. But, these new tariffs, are they going to somewhat complicate those efforts?
Certainly, they could make the path towards that meeting more difficult, but if we look at past experience, for example, China has not always responded to U.S. pressure by walking away from dialogue. During the first Trump administration's trade war, Beijing retaliated with tariffs on U.S. goods, including on agricultural products, but both sides continued negotiations and eventually reached the Phase 1 trade deal. More recently, after the November Trump-Xi summit, both sides agreed on measures to ease tensions, but Washington and Beijing have not seen eye to eye on some of these commitments on how fully implemented they were. But dialogue continued. So looking at these past examples, Beijing has certainly kept channels open even during periods of serious disagreement over trade. China would retaliate, but it would also talk. And it has generally only suspended dialogue when it believes the U.S. has crossed what it considers core sovereignty or security lines, such as, on the Taiwan issue. Since this latest dispute is centered on tariffs and trade, the expectation generally is that Beijing may continue to push back while keeping the door open for negotiations. As to whether those negotiations will happen at the highest levels between presidents and how soon, now that really is an open question.
Well, thanks for that update on U.S.-China relations. CNA senior correspondent Tan Yu-Guan speaking to us live from Shanghai. Now, the new U.S. tariffs are putting a spotlight on forced labor. So what is it exactly? And why is President Trump prioritizing it in his economic agenda? Okay, so let's start with how it's defined. The International Labour Organization explains it as any work or service that's done under threat or which is carried out involuntarily. And this includes things like wage theft and physical abuse. The United Nations has likened it to modern slavery. Now, the U.S. stopped the import of goods made with forced labor back in 1930. This time, it's targeting countries that haven't done enough, either by not banning imports made with forced labor or not properly enforcing bans already in place. So then, why is this a priority for President Trump? Now, experts say it's pretty simple. Countries that use forced labor are deemed to have an unfair competitive advantage. Think lower production costs and the distortion of market prices. It's really tough for law-abiding manufacturers to compete with goods that are artificially cheap. The U.S. Office of the Trade Representative, or USTR, argues that some American businesses have already been undermined and that forced labor goods have already infiltrated the economy. In particular, tobacco, rice, beef, and cotton. The tariffs are not yet final, though, and it's unclear how these levies would improve workers' rights or raise wages. While the White House says that these tariffs target forced labor, some experts argue that the real goal is to cement a broader and more permanent tariff regime.
It's not actually about stopping forced labor or trade in forced labor, despite what the United States claims. It's really about rebuilding a tariff wall of between 10 and 12.5% against 60 of the U.S. largest trading partners, covering almost 99% of all imports into the United States. So basically, you have replaced one temporary statute now for one that is going to be much more longer lasting and much more legally durable.
Economists say affected countries may be reluctant to retaliate because tariffs often end up hurting domestic businesses and consumers.
We do know that the majority of these tariffs are paid by domestic consumers. So any country that retaliates against the U.S. is, putting tariffs on U.S. exports to their countries are really harming their own domestic businesses and their own domestic consumers. So many countries realize this, and that's why we haven't seen large reactions of retaliations in response to any of the tariffs that the Trump administration has implemented.
Well, the latest tariffs also come with significant exemptions. Analysts say they are a continuation of the approach adopted from earlier tariff rounds.
We saw last year when the reciprocal tariffs were rolled back and a lot of exemptions were made after the first set of very stringent announcements, let's just put it that way. The US realized that for a range of items, they either were in short supply or not available at all in the US market, and that was pushing prices up. Industries were complaining, and so they put in place a range of exemptions, which is why the tariff shock for certain Asian economies, and particularly Southeast Asian economies, was not as bad as first predicted. So in essence, they're continuing with that approach.
Meantime, China has banned exports of dual-use goods to 14 European Union companies. The move comes after the EU imposed fresh sanctions on Chinese firms over Russia. China's Commerce Ministry says the companies, including Italian electric motor maker Lafette, has been added to its export control list. The ban is in effect starting today. Chinese exporters are prohibited from supplying them with goods that could have only both civilian and military uses. Beijing says the measures are aimed at protecting its national security and interests and fulfilling international obligations such as non-proliferation. We're going to go for a short break now, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, South Korean firms flush with cash from the AI boom are stepping up investments in the United States. And as Japan's inflation rises, we take a look at the revised list of items used to calculate consumer prices and why neckties have been cut from the basket of goods. Hello again. Well, if you've just joined us, you're just in time for some business news with Olivia Marzuki. So, Liv, it looks like it's been a bruising session for markets across Asia. We're talking about tech stocks leading the losses and declines. But what exactly is driving this selling pressure?
I'll tell you, not one, not two, but three. There's a triple blow impacting investors today. First, we have the escalating tensions in the Middle East, and then the soaring oil prices and fresh doubts about whether massive AI spending will deliver the returns that markets have been expecting. East Asian markets closed the day sharply lower, tracking a Wall Street sell-off. Now, the losses were most severe in tech names, which came under heavy selling pressure. Japan stock indices deep in the red for both the Nikkei 225 and also the red lower for chip-related names, including Advantest, Tokyo Electron, and Kioxia. Now, South Korea's Kospi plunged nearly 6%, with index heavyweight Samsung falling more than 7% and SK Hynix losing more than 8%. Investors are questioning whether massive AI investments will deliver strong enough returns. Meanwhile, renewed conflict in the Middle East has pushed oil prices higher as Hormuz disruptions lift risk premium and inflation expectations. Brent rebounding towards the $100 a barrel level and WTI trailing behind at $89.50. South Korea's financial regulators speeding up tougher rules for single-stock leverage ETFs. The higher minimum deposit requirement to trade in the instrument is now set at the end of this month from previously early to mid-August. A surge in the popularity of these leverage ETFs tied to SK Hynix and Samsung Electronics has been blamed for the jump in volatility in the broader market. That's since they were allowed back in May. Authorities say that this accelerated timeline has been made possible by active cooperation from financial institutions. Retail investors must maintain a deposit of 30 million Korean won. That's about $20,300 in order to be able to trade in the financial instruments. That was triple the previous amount. Only cash will be counted towards this minimum deposits, whereas assets such as stocks, ETFs, and bonds were previously allowed. Well, South Korean companies are stepping up investments in the U.S., fueled by booming AI profits and a push to avoid higher tariffs. Tech giants Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix are leading the charge, using record earnings from the AI boom to invest in American companies across the AI supply chain. Now, direct investment in the U.S. more than doubled in the first quarter to $10.2 billion. That's the highest level in nearly 5 years. Bankers say that rising U.S.-China tensions have reduced competition from Chinese buyers, creating new opportunities for South Korean firms to acquire advanced technology assets. The investment drive also extends beyond semiconductors, with Korean firms expanding into robotics, biotech, and shipbuilding. Analysts expect more deals in the second half of the year as AI-driven profits continue to grow, and Seoul moves ahead with plans to invest $350 billion under a trade agreement aimed at lowering U.S. tariffs on South Korean exports. South Korea's chip boom also spilling over into the country's real estate market, with the government tightening property curbs in areas outside of Seoul earlier this month over speculation concerns. That's as apartment prices in the capital continue to rise for the 77th straight week. Housing prices last month were up almost 10% on year. An average apartment in Seoul cost just a little more than $1 million last month, around 2.7 times the nation's average. While houses are still considered affordable compared to its East Asian neighbors, an apartment would take more than 11 years of one's annual income to pay off, and that's as Seoul's real estate market continues to heat up. But why do prices remain stubbornly high? Academics say it's a mix of geography and economics. Land is scarce in Seoul, with new housing unable to keep up with demand. Low interest rates after the global financial crisis also made it less attractive for people to save, and many saw property as a good store of value, further pushing up demand. The real estate market is a hot issue in South Korea. With high prices and strict lending limits, many people, especially the young, are losing hope of owning their own place. Frustrations were apparent earlier this week, with President Lee Jae-myung facing criticism when he sold his apartment. He was accused of skirting borrowing limits put in place by his administration by extending credit to the buyers. In the latest Gallup poll published yesterday, more than a fifth of respondents say property is their biggest gripe against Mr. Yi. In a televised forum yesterday, the president signaled further tightening, including increasing property holding tax by up to 3 times, but admitting that doing so would cause quite something like a public uprising. Mr. Yi also compared Seoul's housing sector to Tokyo back in the 1990s during the asset bubble crash, which led to the so-called lost decade of growth in Japan. Core inflation in Japan last month rose for the first time since March, boosting the case for another rate hike by the Bank of Japan later this year. Consumer Price Index, or CPI, excluding fresh food, was up 1.6% on year. It is driven by higher energy costs that were dampened by subsidies. With the flare-up of fighting in the Middle East sending oil back to levels seen in May, an expert shares what could happen if oil prices continue to rise.
Anything above 100 is worse, and there is potential that it could go up to 130, according to some estimates, if this real blockage continues on both arteries of the ocean there, the Hormuz and the one near where this in the Suez Canal and down. So I think it's a big issue, and it's going to spike up inflation, which we don't want. So that'll be a tremendous jolt, a negative jolt to the economies of the emerging markets and the countries dependent on oil.
Now, Japan's latest inflation numbers are out, but what really caught our eye isn't the inflation rate itself. It's what's inside the inflation basket. And here to break it all down for us, once again, we have Olivia Marzuki. So, Liv, tell us a bit more about how Japan has updated, the list of items it uses to calculate these so-called consumer prices, something that it apparently only does once every 5 years. So what's the surprise this time around?
Yes, Oteli. So every 5 years, the Statistics Bureau reviews what Japanese households are actually buying, and it updates the CPI basket, so it continues to reflect everyday spending patterns. It is a surprisingly important habit and exercise because inflation is only as accurate as the basket you're measuring. So if people's lifestyles change, then the basket has to change with them. And this year's revision include one particularly symbolic exclusion and departure. For the first time since the post-war CPI basket was introduced in 1948, neckties have been removed. So that's for men. For women, stockings and ties were also out. On paper, these items are just consumer items, but in reality, they represent a bigger shift. There's a major shift happening right now in how Japanese society works.
Stocking and ties, I can kind of see that. I'm not a big fan of those. But necktie, though, that's a surprise. I mean, it's such a big part of, the classic Japanese salaryman look. So why exactly is it disappearing?
So times have changed, obviously, and Japanese workplaces have also evolved quite a bit, Oteli. So that traditional salaryman image is becoming less representative of the modern workforce in Japan. For decades, the necktie has been a mandatory dress code. It is almost a uniform in corporate Japan, but that culture has steadily loosened. Back in 2005, about 20 years ago, the government launched Cool Biz campaign. Very interesting. This is to encourage workers to ditch their jackets and their ties to basically reduce the use of aircon in the office. And then COVID-19 pandemic hit. It accelerated hybrid work. People are not wearing formal clothes anymore. And companies are getting more comfortable letting their employees wear more business casual attire. And there's also a demographic angle. Let's not forget that Japan's workforce is becoming older. And more people are getting diversity and increasingly employed in sectors that are not traditional, where formal office simply is not the norm anymore. And the trade numbers reflect that. The imports for Japan's necktie have fallen to roughly 1/3 of their levels in 2009, according to an FT report. So removing neckties from that CPI basket is not a way of making fashion statement. It is a way to acknowledge that they no longer carry the same weightage in the nation's household spending.
So I hear what you're saying, Olivia. Basically, less boardroom, more business casual. So then my next question is, what then is replacing the ties in the CPI basket?
Interestingly, the additions are just as revealing because they point to where the consumer spending is growing. Protein powder, for one, is joining the basket, reflecting that growing and rising demand for health and personal wellness market. Pet insurance also been added, recognizing the country's rising spending on companion animal, the emotional support animal, as households becoming smaller and population ages. Bicycle helmets, another one. That's another new item following changes to road safety rules in Japan and growing cycling use. So taken together, these numbers, these changes tell us how Japanese consumers are spending. And it's relatively less on formal workwear and more on health, personal wellness, and lifestyle products.
And their pets as well.
And pets.
Well, thanks so very much for that analysis. At least you've given us an impression where Japanese society is going. So thanks for that, Olivia. Right, on that note, we are going to go for a short break now, but coming up next on East Asia tonight, maritime security has dominated this week's ASEAN meetings in Manila, with tensions from the South China Sea to the Strait of Hormuz taking center stage. Well, we're going to be speaking with an expert after the break to unpack the key takeaways and what they mean for the region. Plus,
We see these actors all very much working together, so we should also, share information.
The EU's foreign policy chief tells CNA why Europe and ASEAN must work more closely on security as threats become increasingly interconnected. You're watching East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. President Trump's new tariffs draw swift reactions across the region, with China condemning the move and Japan expressing regret. The White House says the measures target unfair trade practices. Now, ASEAN foreign minister talks wrap up in Manila, with maritime concerns dominating discussions on regional security. 4 more countries have also joined the ASEAN Peace Pact, known as the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. Well, the gathering also highlighting ASEAN's global reach. The EU's foreign policy chief says that Europe's security is closely linked to that of Southeast Asia. Well, ASEAN member states and partner nations have ended 4 days of talks in Manila. Several countries signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation as the pact marks its 50th anniversary. Sweden, Poland, Romania and Lithuania became the latest signatories, bringing the total number of parties to 59. The treaty is ASEAN's legally binding peace and security pact, governing relations between member states. Meanwhile, tensions in the South China Sea topped the agenda of the 4-day talks. Manila says Chinese vessels fired water cannons at Philippine government boats near Scarborough Shoal for a second straight day. China says it took what it calls control measures against Philippine vessels it says were operating illegally. Well, this marks the third maritime confrontation between the two sides this week. Maritime security concerns from the South China Sea to the Strait of Hormuz have emerged as the hottest topic at this week's ASEAN meetings in the Philippines. Earlier issues such as energy, food, and the Myanmar crisis were also addressed by the top diplomats of the bloc and its partners. Our CNA senior correspondent Leong Wai-kit has this report.
Fresh clashes in the Middle East broke out ahead of the week-long series of ASEAN meetings in Manila. And a day before the meeting started, the Philippines and China accused each other of starting this confrontation near the disputed Second Thomas Shoal in the South China Sea. Days later, Scarborough Shoal came under the spotlight. China claimed Philippine vessels invaded into its waters. The Philippines accused China Coast Guard of spraying water cannon at its vessels. Earlier, the bloc's foreign ministers expressed serious concern over the increasingly volatile situation in the Strait of Hormuz, which, while geographically further from the region, is not just diplomatically close, but also economically significant to it.
Iran demands the right, which they do not have under any existing legal mechanism, to control the transit of traffic through the Straits of Hormuz. And if we create a precedent in the Middle East where a nation state can decide that they are going to control an international waterway, charge a toll, and if you don't pay them, blow up your ships, we have created a very dangerous precedent which will repeat itself in other parts of the world, including in this region.
Singapore Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan said the recent escalation in the Strait of Hormuz, including attacks on Saudi tankers in the Red Sea, was one central concern at the ASEAN meetings.
I'm glad to report that amongst all the speeches made by a very wide range of foreign ministers, everyone doubled down on the need to comply with international law, to maintain the primacy of UNCLOS and freedom of navigation and overflight. So basically, the secondary concern was compliance with international law.
But still, there are differences to be managed. Countries like Australia, Japan and the Philippines have criticized China for recent maritime drills, citing safety concerns. China views its drills as routine and not targeting any third country. Aside from bloc to partner discussions, bilateral meetings were also on the agenda, including talks between China and the Philippines. Ms. Lazaro said the recent maritime incidents would become part of the Code of Conduct negotiations, but didn't go into detail. But overall,
on the South China Sea, what was given attention is the Code of Conduct. that ASEAN now and China is geared towards the conclusion, hopefully the conclusion of the Code of Conduct by the end of this year. And this seems to be the focus of many of the countries, and I can see some political will from all the countries involved.
US and China's top diplomats also held closed-door meetings in Manila.
I think to their credit, both of them are trying to approach this in a careful, deliberate and constructive way. In particular, I would say I'm glad that at least at this point in time, neither of them are forcing us to choose sides.
Close to home, the Myanmar crisis was discussed. Thailand recently mentioned Aung San Suu Kyi as among a set of indicators to measure the progress made by Min Aung Hlaing's administration in implementing the 5-point consensus. Critics often worry she would be exploited and used as a bargaining chip.
Well, first, she's not a chip to be bargained over. I mean, she's the leader of a political party which clearly enjoys significant support in Myanmar. What ASEAN has said is if there are going to be changes in our engagement, it has to be predicated on measurable progress that a reasonable person looking at the parameters can say, yes, this is positive. So the examples of these parameters: reduce the violence, hopefully even eliminate violence against civilians and vulnerable groups, the release of political prisoners. Though Aung San Suu Kyi is one of those prisoners. But the purpose of the release is not just release for release sake, but in order to enable honest-to-goodness conversations, reconciliation, and a solution that is Myanmar-led and owned by the Myanmar people themselves.
If ASSK or Daw Aung San Suu Kyi can be some kind of an element, perhaps, but what is still important for us is the 5-point consensus. Again, those 4 points that has been discussed.
Philippines Foreign Secretary Teresa Lazaro plans to make a trip to Myanmar in the second half of the year. The big question is whether the Min Aung Hlaing-led administration will allow her access to Daw Aung San Suu Kyi. Leong Wek, CNA, Manila.
Well, for more insights, let's bring in Ellen Chong, Senior Fellow, Center for Multilateralism Studies at S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Well, thanks very much, Dr. Chong, for joining us on East Asia tonight. So it looks like maritime security, that has been a major theme this week. But delegates can't help but notice they've also been talking about a Strait of Hormuz alongside the South China Sea. So, I mean, the question is, what does that tell us how ASEAN is thinking about maritime security today?
Well, ASEAN's position on maritime security, as far as official statements go, has not changed in decades. Basically, it is UNCLOS, and in general, the respect for maritime rules, because all the states of ASEAN, including the landlocked ones, depend heavily on transit, innocent transit by merchant vessels in Southeast Asian waters. And even those that are landlocked depend on transshipment through neighbors' ports and so on and so forth. And you can talk about recent developments like the Funan Tetra Canal in Cambodia, which actually creates more of a kind of coastal boundary for trade for Cambodia. And of course, Vietnam has always, its neighbor, has always been an important maritime trader and so on. So I think it's natural that it features. And of course, there is the whole controversy over the South China Sea, a never-ending one. And I think ASEAN has managed to keep a lid on it despite what appears, I stress, to be China's provocations in the past 5 days or so.
Now, Dr. Chong, one point that kept coming up was the importance of international law and freedom of navigation. But how much influence do these principles actually have, when we're seeing so much tension at sea and that continues to rise?
Okay, it is in the nature of international law, including international maritime law, that precedents have resonances, okay, if I can put it that way, across the world. If there is trouble in the Straits of Hormuz, is that the norm? Okay, one has to ask, if you're a policymaker, if you are a naval person on a ship in a contested waterway, does it have resonance across every possible strategic waterway? The point about Southeast Asia and ASEAN is that we are holding the line here to say no, or what's happened in the Straits of Hormuz cannot apply here and should not apply here at all. And the fact that ASEAN has produced a communique to reiterate this, and you have heard our Foreign Minister Vivian Balakrishnan reiterate this, shows that ASEAN is in good standing. We're trying to hold the line here to say that UNCLOS applies and we respect the peaceful transit of all commercial vessels through our waters. And this is the importance of this meeting.
Dr. Chong, this week clearly created opportunities for both U.S. and Chinese engagement, as well as Chinese and Philippines engagement. These sort of bilateral relationships, how does it shape the broader regional picture?
Yes, this goes back to a very time-honored ASEAN diplomatic characteristic, which is its convening power as a group of small and weak states. Okay, perhaps you can concede some of them have aspirations to become some degree of middle powers. But you see, we are not a club of great powers, unlike perhaps the European Union. So, because we play up our convenience, all right, as a group of concerned Asian states that happen to be very happy to invite all interested parties, including China, United States, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, etc., including Russia, by the way, this is the ASEAN Regional Forum, to join us, right, in annual diplomatic discussions, just so that we have institutionalized means of dialogue. And this, in a sense, forestalls any possibility of the resort to military solutions on the ground. But of course, this requires, I think, the skill of ASEAN foreign ministers all of the time, all right, to ensure that these dialogue channels remain open regardless of the temperature of international order anywhere else in the world.
So just looking beyond this week's meetings, looking ahead, what do you think is the biggest strategic challenge you think ASEAN will face in the next couple of years?
I think it's still the same old issues from perhaps a year ago. First of all, within the neighborhood, there is Myanmar. And of course, there is the need to keep our internal trade flows going. There's a lot of interest, I think, in building complementarity amongst ASEAN economies to face the current tensions in the trade climate. Of course, there's so many elephants in the room here. It's not just China, it's also the United States. And of course, President Trump announced fresh tariffs literally in the middle of the meetings. So I think that there is a need for greater intra-ASEAN self-reliance in terms of avoiding competitive zero-sum economic relationships. And I think ASEAN is moving forward in that regard, albeit slowly. And with the United States, I think we've also managed a very frank but positive dialogue with Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He did not say anything, as far as I can tell, noteworthy about the latest, raising of tariffs. But he did say that the United States is here to stay. He mentioned the figure of 100%. And of course, that is reassuring in the sense that I think the regional security scenario will not change from perhaps 30, 40 years ago when all these, spider web networks of American bilateral security arrangements with some
I'm afraid I have to jump in and interrupt you, Dr. Chong. We have run out of time, but appreciate your insights as always. Alan Chong, Senior Fellow, Center for Multilateralism Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Now, European attendance now very much a given at ASEAN summits and meetings, but much more at stake in talks this year. The EU's foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, in Manila. And she spoke to CNA's Lok Wei-Su to make the case for collaboration amidst conflict.
Yes, I think that it is important that we are really in close contact with our ASEAN partners, EU and ASEAN region to region. We see the security concerns that we have in our region and in your region. They are actually very much interconnected, and that's why it is important that we share information. A lot of wheat, grain, corn that is coming from Ukraine to Vietnam, to other ASEAN countries is now detained in the Black Sea. We see also, the fertilizers that should go to the direction of ASEAN countries are not getting there. So we see also the North Korean soldiers being deployed in Russia's war of Ukraine, and we see these actors all very much working together. So we should also share information, but also see what more can we do together for the security of our two regions.
The European Union and ASEAN neither started the current conflict in the Middle East on Iran. Both regions are paying the price, the economic fallout and the security shifts because of this war on Iran.
Exactly. So higher inflation, higher prices, this is due to the situation in the Strait of Hormuz. And that's why also we were discussing yesterday, freedom of navigation is very important to all member states of the European Union as well as ASEAN. And really our message to the negotiators that those straits that were free and open without any tolls, any service fees before the war should remain so, because otherwise it means higher prices for the rest of the world.
In the recent security assessment endorsed and adopted at the European Union, there was a very clear linkage between issues with Russia, potentially issues with China as well. Are these links something you need to make clear or highlight when you're here in this region?
I think it has become increasingly clear to everybody that the security of our region is closely interlinked with the security of ASEAN as well. I mean, we see North Korean soldiers being deployed in Ukraine. We see also the support between Iran and Russia, the cooperation going very, very strong. So this is affecting us all. I mean, the same drones that were used attacking Ukraine are now attacking the Gulf countries. What we also see here in the South China Sea is, flex of the muscles, presenting also strength. So that is, of course, increasing also the threats here. And that's why, for example, in the Philippines, we are also supporting our Philippines armed forces with our European Peace Facility so that they can monitor and use the equipment to really prevent these threats.
Chinese plays as a critical, crucial or decisive enabler for continued war on Ukraine by Russia. Final question.
Yes, this is a NATO wording that China is the key enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine because, if they wouldn't support them, maybe they are not doing it publicly, but if their support wouldn't be behind this, Russia couldn't continue.
Well, time now for another break, but coming up next on East Asia Tonight, SK Group's chairman ordered to pay his former wife $640 million. We take a look at how this legal battle spanning nearly a decade unfolded. The South Korean court has ordered SK Group's chairman to pay his former wife 944 billion won, or $644 million in one of the country's most closely watched legal battles. Now, the case has stretched nearly a decade and also raised questions about how marital assets built around family-run conglomerates should be divided. CNA's senior correspondent, Lim Yun-suk, reports from Seoul.
It has been called South Korea's divorce of the century. A billionaire business tycoon and the daughter of a former president. A marriage that ended in scandal and a legal battle spanning nearly a decade. Choi Tae-won and No So-young married in 1988 and have 3 children. Their marriage broke down in 2015 after Mr. Choi publicly acknowledged an affair and a child outside marriage. 2 years later, he filed for divorce, triggering a legal battle centered on how to divide his fortune and whether his SK Group shares should be treated as marital property. The size of the property settlement changed dramatically as the case moved through the courts. In 2022, a lower court awarded Ms. No 66.5 billion Korean won, or about $48 million then, and another 100 million won in alimony. 2 years later, an appeals court increased that to 1.38 trillion won, ruling that Mr. Che's SK shares should be included in the marital assets. It also raised the alimony to 2 billion won. The Supreme Court later set aside the property division and ordered a fresh hearing, citing legal errors in how the amount had been calculated, though it upheld the alimony awarded. On Friday, the court lowered the asset division awarded to Ms. No to 944 billion won. It ruled that Mr. Che's SK shares were marital assets subject to division, but excluded shares he had transferred before the marriage broke down and omitted funds from his former father-in-law.
오늘 판결에 대해서는 아직 판결문을 받아보지 못한 상태이기 때문에 판결문을 검토한 후에 구체적인 입장을 말씀드릴 수 있을 것 같습니다. 참고 여부도 판결문을 검토한 후에 입장을 정리해서 말씀드리겠습니다.
After nearly a decade in court, South Korea's so-called divorce of the century has become one of the country's most consequential legal battles over wealth, inheritance, and corporate ownership. Whether Friday's ruling finally ends the dispute may now depend on whether either side decides to appeal. Im Yeon-suk, CNA, Seoul.
Now, Shanghai's low-altitude economy expo opened this week. While flying taxis may grab the attention, at the trade show, companies are racing to find out what else these aircraft can do. And CNA's Tanya Guan reports from Shanghai.
A future that's waiting to take off. That's what the machines on display at this expo represent. Among the most eye-catching is this autonomous passenger aircraft. From the outside, it looks like any other passenger drone, but let me show you the inside. It's a bit of a squeeze, but essentially there's space for 2 passengers. You notice I said passengers. That's because this screen only shows you the map. There are no controls within this cabin. This passenger drone flies without a pilot. Yihang's aircraft can carry 2 people for about 30 kilometers on a single charge. The company is ahead of most domestic rivals in certification. But even Yihang says widespread adoption will take time.
我觉得3年内一部分的城市先会实现一些示范性的场景，比如说先会有这么3条、5条或者10条左右的这样的固定的飞行航线。
Despite the long runway ahead, many companies at the expo are already looking beyond flight to function, like how a propeller-driven aircraft might fit safely into a city.
Our eVTOL, which stands for Electrical Vertical Takeoff and Landing Aircraft, is in full ducted fan structure. So a duct is a structure with a propeller surrounded within the aircraft, providing a much safer, quieter, a more urban-friendly structure of urban passenger taking. The takeoff and landing space is only 1/10 of the space that a traditional helicopter could take. You can take off on your parking lot, rooftop.
This aircraft remains in the early stages of certification. But EHawk CEO says ahead of passenger services, other low-altitude aircraft could already transform the ways how some things are done.
Around 2027, which is next year, we will begin to see the application of them in a specific scenarios, such as emergency rescuing, saving people that are trapped on a burning building, or cargo, taking products from ships to the shore. Yeah. Also, a low-altitude tourism to replace helicopters.
Those specialized users are already becoming a major theme. For example, one of EHawk's drones displayed here is fitted with a robotic arm. Aside from simply retrieving objects, It could also be deployed to clean high-rise windows or even take part in extinguishing high-rise fires. Another company, meanwhile, is trying to stand out by making drone light shows more efficient. Its containerized system is designed for easy transportation. Once on location, it can deploy over 500 drones in 1 minute. Then there's this single-seat machine that feels like a flying e-bike. Its developers are seeing demand from niche overseas customers, such as large farm operators, recreational users, and wealthy overseas buyers, representing yet another bet where demand might emerge. Taken together, these machines show an industry moving into a new phase. The challenge is no longer simply proving that an electrical aircraft can leave the ground.
不光是在中国，对全世界来说，未来先进空中交通发展的这个标准怎么制定，规则怎么制定，管理的方向怎么来做，管理的模式怎么来做，法规规章怎么来制定，其实相对来说，现在呢还都不是特别的健全和完善。有了这些规章制度之后呢，对企业来说，我有了法律的边界，我有了合规的边界，我就知道在这个边界内我怎么去做更多的这样的发展和创新。
Before driving a car, we need to pave the roads first, and that's the same for flying cars. Paving a road in the air means the government being prepared to regulate, to track down every single aircraft, where it's going, which altitude it's on, whether it's going to collide with another aircraft, what will happen if there's an emergency scenario. So low altitude economy depends heavily on governmental efforts.
For now, air commuting remains some distance from becoming an everyday reality. And some companies are betting that other applications will take off commercially much sooner. Tan Yu-Guan, CNA, Shanghai.
And on that note, it's time to wrap up Friday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Hope you've enjoyed it. Have a good evening.